heavy metal ambition. Now we talk about those heavy metal bands that recaptured an awful lot of the spirit, maybe of the progressive rock bands of the 1970s, groups that took heavy metal and music itself very seriously and wanted to do something with a real sense of seriousness of purpose, not so much the kind of dandyism of the LA hair bands or the kind of radio-friendly, hook-oriented music of people like Guns N' Roses, Van Halen, or Bon Jovi, but something that really had some sort of substance to it. Music that had contrasts, light and dark, acoustic and electric, loud and soft, major, minor. I mean, all kinds of the usual kinds of contrast that we think about when we talk about building sprawling pieces of music, maybe going 7 or 8 minutes in length, sort of more thinking more in terms of the epic than in terms of the radio single. Groups that we're talking about when we talk about metal ambition are usually described as blending together speed metal and thrash metal. Now, I'm not going to get into all the sort of fine shadings of what constitutes speed and thrash and all the rest of that. I'll leave it to you to go onto the internet and to listen to some music and decide what all of that is. Let's though turn our attention to probably the group that, if we're going to talk about metal ambition, are the poster children for that and the real leaders of that movement, and that's Metallica, coming out of Los Angeles via San Francisco for a short period of time, featuring drummer Lars Ulrich, guitarist and vocalist James Hetfield, and initially Dave Mustaine on the guitar. Mustaine is kicked out of the band when they're recording their first album, interestingly enough, right here in Rochester, New York, not too far from where I'm filming these lectures for you. Anyway, Dave Mustaine is out during the first album, Kirk Hammett is in, and they release in 1983 that album called Kill 'Em All. It has a slightly different title, but the record company wouldn't release it under that title. I'll leave it to you to look that up on the internet to see what that was. They follow with Ride the Lightning in 1984, Master of Puppets in 1986, and the big breakthrough album for Metallica comes in 1988. It's the number 6 album, And Justice for All. And this is the record that really, I mean, Metallica fans will tell you, yeah, Master of Puppets, Ride the Lightning, those are important sort of early records, and they are. But the one that really broke Metallica as an important band that people were really starting to pay attention to is this album, And Justice for All. And again, we're talking about the late into the second half of the 80s, right? We're talking about 1988. The big song on that record is a song called One, which is a large-scale, 2-part form that lasts over 7 minutes. It goes about 7 minutes and 30 seconds. So when I tell you that we've got a piece that sort of, it comes in close to 8 minutes length, that is this sort of epic piece in 2 parts and all of this kind of thing that deals with serious lyrics and contrasts, sort of textural contrast and that kind of thing. You might think I was talking about Yes's Roundabout or Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Trilogy, but in fact we're talking about Metallica here and the sort of lead track from And Justice for All, their 1988 hit. What's interesting about that is that in the 1989 Grammy performances, they were up for the best hard rock metal performance, and everybody thought that Metallica was going to get that award for And Justice for All. And so the person comes out with the envelope and says, the winner is, and it turned out the winner was none other than Jethro Tull for the album Crest of the Knave. Now, Jethro Tull had never gotten a Grammy back in the day when they should have gotten it. So in many ways, it was kind of a makeup for what hadn't happened. That often happens with awards. People get them after they should have gotten them because people realize that it's been a real omission. Nevertheless, it was a big surprise, not just to Metallica, who just performed One, did a fantastic live version of One, were standing in the wings, waiting to come out and get their award, and instead it goes to Jethro Tull, whose manager had told them they didn't need to attend the ceremony because Metallica was most certainly going to get the award. Well, that kind of, the slight little sort of scandal or dust-up that occurred around that actually maybe did Metallica as much good publicity-wise as if they had actually won it, because there were all kinds of outraged people who couldn't believe it happened this way. Probably not so good for Jethro Tull, but you know, it all worked out well for Metallica. They'd really become the founders of this this serious-minded, ambitious approach to heavy metal. So groups that come later, like Dream Theater, for example, who are maybe the lead group, coming somewhat later in the idea of progressive metal, really take their point of orientation from this Metallica stuff from this period. Well, I mentioned before Dave Mustaine, who got kicked out of the group or left the group or whatever it is goes on between people when people no longer in a band. Anyway, he was out. He reforms and puts together his own group called Megadeth, doing a lot of what he would have done with Metallica had he stayed in the band. By 1985, that group is back with Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. They followed up in 1986 with Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? Neither one of those albums having a tremendous amount of commercial success. Again, big among heavy metal enthusiasts, but not the kind of albums that Metallica had with And Justice for All in terms of success, or people like Bon Jovi, Guns N' Roses, or Van Halen. Not that kind of success. But by 1992, they had a #2 album in this country, #5 in the UK, with Countdown to Extinction. In these days, when we think about those bands, we really oftentimes think of Metallica and Megadeth, really almost in the same breath, because of not only the closeness of the members, but also the closeness of the aesthetic and intention of the music and what it's trying to accomplish. Some of the other groups that we can talk about with regard to metal ambition, coming out of New York City, Anthrax, who had a big album with Among the Living, 1987, influential at least, if not it was not a fantastic commercial success. Or Slayer, their album Rain in Blood from 1986. Well, let's talk a little bit about what some of the features of this music is that we haven't had a chance so far to articulate fully. The more ambitious metal really featured a lot of virtuoso instrumental playing. And we see this in heavy metal just generally, the guitarist as the kind of virtuoso performer. Some of the groups that emphasize the song more than the virtuosity, the guitar solo may be simpler, it may be shorter, the whole thing may be more compact. More like sort of the Beatles compared to the Stones. These were groups that were more interested in the actual song itself. But a lot of the groups really emphasized the guitar solo. The prototypes for this, as I say, would have been Ritchie Blackmore coming out of Deep Purple, and then Eddie Van Halen from Van Halen, already starting in the late 1970s, Randy Rhoads from the Ozzy Osbourne group. These are all, if you had bought guitar magazines back in the late 80s and they'd been interviewing people and giving transcriptions and that kind of thing, the heavy metal players, it would have all sort of gone back to that. And that's really that idea of the solo, the virtuosic guitar solo. That's one of the things that alternative rock in the early 1990s was reacting against, the long solo. What's with all these long virtuosic solos? Forget that. This is really a big feature of this music. And again, this harkens back to the hippie rock of the progressive rockers and some of the more mainstream groups like Led Zeppelin. So these fast, technical guitar solos. There were probably no other style of rock guitarist so dedicated to being able to play really, really fast notes on the guitar than heavy metal guitarists. So oftentimes, even though one of the knocks on heavy metal is, they're lazy, they don't want to work real hard. A lot of times you're talking about guitar players who are working as hard as any classical musician, practicing 4, 5, 6 hours a day just to be able to gain technical mastery of the instrument. So a lot of dedication that goes with that. But there's also a continuation, as I said, of the ambition from the hippie aesthetic, the big ideas, the concepts, the contrasts, the tie-in with album cover art and images, lyrics that are to deal with something that seems meaningful and is not just devoted to, romantic or sexual or these kinds of alienation kinds of topics. And so, in many ways, I consider heavy metal in the 80s to sort of carry the torch for the hippie aesthetic in a lot of ways. I also said that to a certain extent, music videos return again to the hippie aesthetic when music videos get more ambitious. So we see that this idea of being ambitious in music, during a time in the 80s when music is supposed to be going back to simplicity, this idea of getting ambitious about how you do the music stays in there. It's just not in the same places it was in the 70s. It appears in the videos. It appears in heavy metal music. Well, if we tie everything back to MTV in the 80s and what we talked about last week, I've mentioned a couple times already that you can really tell that heavy metal is on the mainstream radar when in 1987 the show Headbangers Ball debuts and really is devoted entirely to heavy metal videos, and people now can really focus not only on the groups that are having the big hits, but some of the other groups now who are getting attention because of the groups that sort of opened the door for them. So that's the story of the development of heavy metal from a relatively underground scene, separating itself out in the 70s, building across the first half of the 80s and the second half of the 80s via a couple of really big albums by groups who aren't even really thought of so much as heavy metal anymore, opening the door to the success of a lot of heavy metal groups and establishing heavy metal as one of the most important styles of the late 80s. Interestingly, this style, one of the styles that the alternative musicians of the 1990s most were reacting against, but those musicians, the alternative musicians, had also been very much influenced by that music. So it's a story that's familiar to us from New Wave at the end of the 70s, and we'll turn to that next week. For now, let's move on to the second part of our story this week, and that is the story of rap, and talk about the roots of rap.